Well, I'm Secretary General of the WFFP, the World Forum of Fisher People. The organization I worked for, Masifundisi and Coastal Links, we joined WFFP way back in 2004. It is about 3-4 years later that we became actively involved in developing the guidelines for small-scale fishing. That was firstly based on the national policy that we were developing in South Africa, but secondly, that policy also informed the global international guidelines that was being developed by COFI at the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, at United Nations. So a lot of what we were putting in the national policy for South Africans, for ourselves, is what we also contributed to the development of the international small-scale fishing guidelines. So those two sets of guidelines, those two sets of policies actually speak to the fishing context, to the needs and aspirations of fishing communities, small-scale artisanal fishing communities, which is ourselves in South Africa. And that is where the two sets of guidelines, well, the international guidelines and our policy actually speak to each other. So we need to support it in South Africa. We need to make sure how the issues that's not in the not in the guidelines internationally, but is in our policy, how that gap can be closed. We must identify those issues and make sure that it gets put into the implementation processes. For me, that is the important challenge right now, because already we've won half the battle, because the two sets of policies are based on similar principles and on similar objectives. You see, for small-scale fishers, when we speak about fishing for a livelihood, we actually integrate everything. Everything comes together in what we do. We basically produce, our fishing activities produces food for ourselves, for our neighbors, and for the world at large. So it is food production for livelihoods, but what it does is it's not just in a factory producing food and sending it off on a conveyor belt. It involves ourselves as people, it involves our families, from preparing to go out to sea, from going out to sea, catch in a particular way that is in fact harmonious with nature. We don't pollute, we don't overcatch, we don't catch undersize. We are sensitive to the natural resource and the natural environment. And when we come back, we sell to our communities and we share to our in our communities. Now that is important because fishing then becomes part of our culture. It is not just a mechanistic way of producing and marketing food. It's part of our culture, it's part of our society, it's part of our community. So what we need to have is security of access to the ocean. The only property that we have is the ocean, because the ocean provides us the source of our income and the source of our food production. So we need to have what people call security of access to the ocean. That is security of tenure. Now for fishing, the security of tenure is access to the ocean. Unlike for people who do farming, the security of tenure for them is the farmlands. So when we speak about this holistic way of accessing the resource, having sustainable access, producing in a manner that is sensitive to the environment, and producing food, we're talking about our holistic life. And that is the crucial thing between tenure and small-scale fishing. So the small-scale fishing guidelines and our policy back in South Africa speaks to this thing that we call agroecology. That agroecology is about people, it's about life, it's about using the resource sustainably and not polluting, not overcatching, but also ensuring that the resource source, as in the ocean or land water bodies, inland water bodies, that all of that belongs to us to use in a sustainable manner. It may not belong to us as a piece of land or as a piece of property, but it is the resource, it is the property that gives us security to make our living. And that is why security of tenure and access to fishing rights speaks to each other, and that is what we want. That's what we're about. That's what agroecology is about. Yeah, the international guidelines for small-scale fishing, I, I have to say that in many ways, we as part of civil society globally, we as small-scale fishers in South Africa, we co-own it. You know, we were part of writing it. We took part as, you know, we were involved as part of a broader group of civil society organizations across the world. It's important to remember that the contributions in writing the guidelines did not come from governments only. It did not come from consultants or academics. It actually came from communities worldwide. You know, we made substantial contributions, and most of what we said is in it. So I think that's an important point to make. But we have to acknowledge, it took about 8 years to get there. You know, it wasn't an overnight thing, but so we had to make sure that we had the resilience, that we had the kind of confidence to speak for ourselves and to sustain our energies and our thought processes, you know, so that all of that went into the guidelines, both in terms of ideology, in terms of schools of thought, and in terms of the real need on the ground. It's important to say that. It's important to acknowledge that as well, that the guidelines does not belong to governments or to COFI or to FAO. The fishery guidelines in particular took a long time, and it is essentially because of our making that it is there. So yeah, but I think that is also, it's also important to say therefore that the content of what is in that document didn't fall out of the sky. The content actually came from communities across the world, from fishing communities, men and women, fishers, youth, whoever, you know, we consulted with in various meetings all over the world. And yeah, so in that way I feel that the guidelines does belong to us, that it has the interests of small-scale fishing or small-scale fishing communities at heart. Now here's a crucial issue, that in South Africa, or let me put it differently, one of the things that the guidelines promote, both the 10-year guidelines and the small-scale fishing guidelines, but the small-scale fishing guidelines in particular, it promotes the allocation of fishing rights to communities, not just to individuals. And this is where we differ with the old system substantially. The old system gives fishing rights to individual companies or to individuals as a private right. It's their private property. We disagree with that. The guideline says fishing rights can be given to a fishing community. And that is a concrete example of the tension between commercial fishing in South Africa and community-based small-scale or artisanal fishing. You know, in the past we've had this fight. There's a battle. Government only had a policy in place that allocates private fishing rights, or private quotas as they called it. And that quota system couldn't apply to us because we function as a community. We didn't function as an individual. So there were always clashes between us and government, between us and the industrial or commercial fishers, because we were structurally and inherently different. We couldn't be the same. So the tension was big, to the extent where there were life threats, to the extent where there were physical battles, to the extent where people actually fought out there on the ocean. But importantly, the worst effect of individual private rights was that families were split. If the one brother got a quota, the other brother did not get a quota. So now two brothers fought with each other. So it broke up families. The private rights, the individual quotas, also then created division between communities, not just families, between communities. So there were huge battles, there currently still are, huge battles that the quota system produces. The guidelines and the new policy in South Africa is completely different. It actually is community-based. It is sensitive to community needs, to family needs. It recognizes that small-scale fishing is a family activity. Problem one solved. Problem two that is solved is that the way small-scale fishing happens is sensitive to the environment. Industrial fishing just goes to fish and fish and fish as much as they can to make as much profit. We fish enough to be able to make a living. So, you know, the guidelines is an answer to the conflict that we have in our fishing communities in South Africa.